recording. All right, I'm recording as of now. All right, so chapter 51 is a very short, simple chapter. It's about provisional coverage. Who can remind me what provisional means?
It's a temporary.
All right, so we're going to talk about different ways that we can put a temporary filling or cover the tooth temporarily until we're able to do something more permanent. Does anybody know any examples of some of the temporary things that we can make? Or some of the provisional, let's use the vocabulary, some of the provisional appliances that we can make for a patient's tooth or teeth?
Crowns.
We can make provisional crowns. What else?
Oh, damn.
What else can be temporary?
Can a filling be temporary?
Yes, we can place a temporary filling, right?
What about no?
Say it one more time.
Is inlays temporary?
We can make a temporary inlay or a temporary onlay. There's one more I'm looking for. Think about an indirect restoration that needs to be sent to the lab to be created, and we would have to cover it.
Could it be a temporary bridge?
A temporary bridge, yes. A temporary bridge can be made as well. Temporary veneer, right? That can also be created, because anything that you have to send out to the lab, you have to remember that there's going to be at least a 2-week waiting period where the patient is not going to have that permanent appliance on their tooth. And you're not going to send them home with a shaved down tooth with nothing to protect it. So if we have to shave down a tooth, take an impression to send to the lab, we have to create a provisional coverage to protect that tooth until we're able to actually put the permanent appliance on. So again, this is a very short chapter. We're just going to go through a little bit of details about it. Okay, so again, as we all know, so provisional coverage is a temporary crown or bridge that is temporarily cemented to a tooth. Okay, so you have to, you want to make sure that what you're creating is very similar to what was already in the patient's mouth, because although it's temporary, we still don't want the patient to be uncomfortable for 2 weeks. You still want to make sure that the patient is able to function with that provisional coverage that you placed on their tooth. Okay, so indications, so meaning what are some reasons why we would choose to use a provisional coverage? So first and foremost is if the patient has some sensitivity and discomfort and we want to wait for that to subside. If you remember, there was a critical thinking question, I don't really remember what chapter it was on, but where we spoke about a patient who had sensitivity and we chose, instead of placing the permanent filling or permanent restoration, I can't remember what it was, we chose to use something temporary instead. Right? Because if we place something permanently and we realize down the line that it's an issue for that patient, now we have to do even more drilling, remove even more tooth structure when we could have just waited a little bit. Another reason that it maintains the function and aesthetics of the prepared tooth. So if you look at those videos of how a crown is created, you see how much tooth structure has to be removed in order to fit a crown over it. Again, we're not going to let the patient walk out with this short, shaved down tooth because they're not going to be able to eat, and it's also not going to look very nice, especially if it's somewhere close to the front. It protects the margins of the preparation, so the margins are close to the gum line. The crowns, the bridges, the veneers that you place on this patient's tooth, they have to sit slightly below the gum line, but if we don't have something protecting that margin, the gums are going to grow over it and we won't be able to seat the permanent restoration all the way. It prevents shifting of the adjacent or opposing teeth. So adjacent teeth are teeth that are next to, opposing teeth are teeth that are opposite, so top versus bottom. Again, if you think back to how much of the tooth structure is shaved down for a crown or a bridge, your teeth are not going to have the contacts anymore. So your teeth are not they're not gonna be touching once you've shaved down that tooth. So you need to place something there so the teeth that are not shaved don't feel like they have to move over into that space or don't think that they can shift into that space. I know some of us have spoken about if you're missing a tooth, sometimes your other teeth will shift into that position. So when we shave the crown off, your mouth sometimes thinks a tooth is missing when it's just the crown itself that's shaved off, and then a tooth may move in that position. And of course, if that happens, now we no longer have space for the crown or the bridge that we tend to put in that place. Okay, are there any questions about these indications? Because I know I just said a lot. So types of provisional coverage, there are two main types. So first we have custom, and then we have prefabricated, and we're going to go through those two types. And you got to really, it depends on it's like on a case-by-case situation, whether the doctor decides whether they want something custom made or whether they want to use a prefabricated or a pre-made crown in order to create a provisional. In both senses, if you're an expanded function dental assistant, you'll be able to create provisional crowns and cement them on for patients once you have that certification. Okay, so for a custom provisional crown, this is the most common type that you would use because it looks better. It looks more like the patient's natural tooth structure. It's more designed to how their tooth looked before you ever shaved it down. So if you are going to create a custom provisional, it's very important that you take an impression of the patient's teeth before the doctor shaves it down, because that is going to be the impression that you use to create this provisional. Once the doctor shaves that tooth down, you can no longer create a custom provisional. You have to use like a prefabricated shell or a prefabricated provisional, something that was already made, and you use that as a template. And again, since it's not custom, it may not fit as well as if you would have done a custom. So you have to make sure you take an impression before you do anything else. One of the things with the doctors I used to work with, one of the things I would do is before I would even open up my setup, I would take that impression if I knew we were going to be creating a preparation for a crown, just so I wouldn't forget. And that's helpful instead of you trying to do it when the doctor comes in, because the doctor is assuming they can just get rocking and rolling. So if you know you're going to be preparing a tooth for a crown, you want to take that impression. Then I would set everything up that you need for the preparation. So at least you know you got that out the way. And then at the end of the preparation, you use that impression to create the crown. Okay. So it can be a little bit time consuming at the end because you have to shave it down. You have to contour it. You have to shape it so that it fits perfectly and it's not irritating to the patient. So it is going to take some attention to detail. It is going to take some artistic ability because again, you're recreating a crown of a tooth. It does provide the best fit, and it is the most natural looking, again, because we're using what their tooth already looked like before to create a provisional for them. So it's going to look as if nothing ever happened. And you can use them for either posterior or anterior crowns or bridges. Either one, it'll work. Any questions about the custom provisional? Okay, so here is an example. Here's a picture of a custom provisional crown, so a custom temporary crown. As you can see underneath the crowns, this is looking like 8, 9, so 7, 8, and 9, because these two look like two centrals. And I'm saying they look like centrals because of how wide they are compared to this lateral right here. So this would be 7, 8, and 9. 7 and 9 have been shaved down to fit a crown over it. What you're seeing in the gums hovered over tooth number 8 is what we call an implant. So temporarily, this patient is going to have this temporary bridge here. Once this implant heals, they're going to have 3 separate crowns. So one crown on 7, there's going to be an implant crown attached here separately, and a separate crown on tooth number 9. So we use the bridge temporarily, but in the end, the goal for this patient is to have 3 separate crowns. So you don't necessarily have to create a temporary bridge for a permanent bridge. In this case, they're using a temporary bridge to create 3 individual crowns. Any questions about this image? So prefabricated crowns are already pre-made. So you, in your office, and of course in our class as well, you'll see a whole bunch of shells of crowns. And you have to use those shells to recreate a tooth for a patient. So usually you would use the prefabricated crown if the patient's tooth has been broken down so much that you can't create a custom crown for them. Like there's no tooth structure for you to use as a template. You can use fabricated crowns for posterior or anterior. All you do is you have a little shell and then you have to mix acrylic into it to kind of bulk it up, to give it some bulkiness, okay? And they can be polymer crowns, polycarbonate, or stainless steel crowns. And a polymer versus polycarbonate is about texture, about look and feel. So we're gonna see if, I don't think the slide has many pictures, but if anything, I'm gonna post some examples of video examples of how do you create a crown both ways. So a polymer crown shell is filled with composite resin. So this material is not as strong as the acrylic. So you would have to tell your patient to be very careful about biting into hard stuff. They have to be very careful about how they are flossing when they have this polymer crown in their mouth, because the material itself is not as strong. It's not going to withstand a lot of trauma. Okay, so the resin material itself is going to bond with the preformed crown, and it also will bond with the tooth. Now, a lot of doctors do not like the polymer crowns because when it's time to take it off, they tend to have more issues with pulling it off and then end up having to shave it down a little bit, which can mess up their prep underneath. Okay, but this is an option. I know some people say that with the polymer crowns, they just look a little bit more natural, but it comes with a lot of issues on the back end. Like I said, a lot of people have issues taking them off, which sometimes you just have to explain to the patient, like, we're going to use another option because it's just going to be easier in the end instead of us struggling to take this off, which is going to kind of give you, which is going to cause us to shave your tooth down unnecessarily. Okay, so here's an example of prefabricated provisional coverage. So we have metal crowns, gold. This is kind of like a copper, I would say. And then we have polymer crowns here as well. Now, a lot of people are not going to use these metal anymore, especially for adults, right? So you're mostly going to see these metal provisional crowns for primary teeth. And you guys have all seen it because I've heard you all say it or ask about those silver crowns that go onto a kid's tooth. And this is what it looks like. It's literally just a shell of metal that we place over the tooth. Okay, and even though we place it on baby teeth permanently, we call it provisional because the primary teeth are temporary. Those teeth do not stay in your mouth your whole life. As we know, we shed those teeth and then we have our permanent teeth that erupt. So it's still considered provisional because those teeth are temporary. Okay, so then we have preformed polycarbonate crowns. These are used in cases where, you know, it's more important for how the patient looks because it comes in more sizes and shapes. You have the option of picking whether you want a big crown or a small crown, or you want it to be contoured a little bit more. It's not just about find a central incisor, find a lateral incisor. They'll have multiple options for each type of tooth, and you're able to use all of those different options and pick the one that fits your patient's tooth the best. It also comes in different shades, so you can kind of match the color as well. Because usually most provisionals are more on the yellowish side. They look more yellowish, but you have the option of ordering polycarbonate crowns that come in different colors. Okay, stainless steel crowns or aluminum crowns. These are designed specifically for premolars and molars. And the main reason for that is because no one wants to walk around with silver teeth in the front. So they come in different sizes. You would only use these if the patient doesn't care. Like if you have an adult patient who's like, I just want to get this over with, just put whatever on there until I can get my crown. But again, most adults do not want these stainless steel crowns. We generally will use them for primary teeth. Okay, so when you have a lot of teeth that need to be replaced in one area, even if you're going to do separate crowns, you can create a prefabricated crown like a bridge, just like we saw in that last picture. So this is just telling you that instead of you going to each tooth and creating a provisional for every single tooth individually, you can just create a bridge and cover all those teeth. And then when it's time to put the permanent crown on, you remove that entire bridge and put the individual crowns on. Does that make sense? Does anybody have issues visualizing that? So it's very similar to that picture we looked at before with the implant. So even though each tooth was going to get an individual crown, we still are going to make the provisional as a bridge, just so we cover it all at one time. And you don't have to worry about recreating a crown for every single tooth that is lost. So again, with this process, you start out with a preliminary impression. What material, based on our lecture from yesterday, what material would we use for a preliminary impression?
Alginate.
Yes, we would use alginate. So again, you don't want to use your final impression material because that's also pretty expensive. Especially because once you create that crown for the patient, once you create that provisional for the patient, you're not going to need that impression material anymore. Now, if you have a patient who has a history of not taking care of their crowns and you're making a provisional and you know that there's a high possibility that the patient may crack or break the provisional, then personally, I would use the final impression material because I know it's not going to shrink over time. As we learned yesterday, when you take an alginate impression, after about 24 hours, the impression is going to shrink. So if you use a preliminary and the patient breaks the provisional and they come back, you don't have an impression to make another crown off of. Now you have to use one of those prefabricated crowns. So criteria for provisional fabrication. So what do you, as the assistant, because again, as an expanded function dental assistant, you are creating these crowns. So here are some things you have to look at, or you have to kind of give yourself a little checklist to make sure you're doing these things correctly. Number one, you want to make sure that it's aesthetically acceptable. I used to have a doctor who I worked with where he would say, make the crown nice, but don't make it too nice. And what he meant by that was you want it to be nice enough so the patient is able to walk out and not feel uncomfortable. But if you make it too close to what a permanent crown looks like, patients will not come back for the permanent crown, which means they won't pay for the permanent crown. And at the end of the day, it is still a business. So you want it to be aesthetically pleasing, but like my doctor used to say, make it nice, but not too nice. The contours are similar to those of a natural tooth structure. So if you remember back in 110, we had chapter 12 where we went into tooth morphology. And in that chapter, it kind of gave you an idea of what each specific tooth in the mouth is supposed to look like, how many cusps these teeth are supposed to have, how wide should the crowns look, right? So you want to make it as close to the natural tooth shape as possible. The cervical margin, again, we can also call the cervical margin the gingival margin, is smooth and it fits snugly. So the area that's going to be close to the gums, you want to make sure it's not bulky. You want to make sure that there are no sharp edges, right, that are going to irritate the gums. The coverage does not extend below the margin. So again, you want it to sit on the margin. You don't want it to go too far down the gingival area because then that's going to cause irritation. And then the occlusal surface is aligned with the occlusal plane of the adjacent teeth. And all that last sentence is telling you is you cannot make the crown too high or too low. It needs to fall right in line to how the patient bites down. So when you finish creating this provisional crown, you should be taking the articulating paper, having the patient bite down to make sure that they're making contact, but also to make sure that they're not hitting on that crown too hard. Okay, any questions about the criteria? Okay, when temporarily cemented, you have to make sure that it is stable, it stays in place, and the patient is comfortable. Okay, if the patient can take their finger and put it on the crown and pop it off, guess what? It's not stable, right? You want to make sure that the patient, when they bite down, they don't feel it rocking back and forth. Okay, also making sure that you're using temporary cement. That is super, super, super important. And I know it seems like redundant, it seems like obvious, but there are a lot of cements that have the same exact name, but one is temporary and one is not. So it's going to be very important for you to read your labels and make sure you are picking the right cement for a temporary or provisional coverage. Because again, like it says here, you want to make sure that you can easily remove it afterward and that you don't have to put any strain to damage the tissues or anything like that, or even have to drill it off because the wrong cement was used. Okay, so here's an example, an image, I should say, a visual representation of what it looks like when you are placing a provisional coverage. So you still want to have contact. So you want to have distal contact, mesial contact, because the patient is still going to need to floss, right? Even though it's a temporary, you want them to floss. You don't want there to be a bacteria buildup. The crown should sit right onto the margin. Okay, when we put the permanent crown, it's going to sit below the margin. It's going to be snug onto the margin. Here's what they're talking about: occlusal contact. It should all be at the same level. It shouldn't be too low. It shouldn't sit too high. It should look very similar to where their contact was before this process was started. Okay, so with the custom provisional method, you need to take a tray or a mold. So again, taking that impression for the patient's teeth. You can use alginate. You can use, they say use base plate wax, and I don't recommend it, and because it's just a flat surface, and it's kind of hard to explain. But when we get into taking bite registration, you'll see that we use base plate wax for bite registration. And then when we compare it to what we use for making your temporary crowns, you'll see why base plate wax is really not something recommended on a clinical level. You can use a vacuum form tray. So a vacuum form tray is very similar to those retainers, like the plastic retainers that are used after you have braces, or what do you call them, bleaching trays, or you can use a putty impression. And the silicone putty is literally, you just take two pieces of putty like Play-Doh, and one is going to be a base, one is going to be a catalyst, and you mix them together, and that creates a reaction that you can put on the patient's teeth, and then that will create an impression for you. And we're going to talk more about the putty in our chapter for 125. Okay, so the materials, they can be divided based on their makeup and supply. So you're gonna, depending on what you're using, they may come in a powder or liquid, it may come in a paste, or it can be something that's similar to our composite, so a light polymerized material, something that you have to cure. Right? Remember, polymerization is the process of curing a material. So again, if you're using powder and liquid materials, it's very similar to mixing, like how we mix our cement. Put equal amounts, you mix them together until it has a uniform consistency. If you're using the paste, make sure one is a base, one is a catalyst, and you mix them together until you have a uniformed consistency. Okay, with the preform technique, you use the shell like we saw before, and you add the composite resin material into the shell, and then you place it onto the tooth until it completely sets. Once it sets on the tooth that is being prepared, then you take it out and you can make adjustments. So you can shave it to make it sit on the margin. If there's an area that's seated too high, you can shave it down, but you have to wait for the material to set. And it says here, it takes about 90 seconds for it to set. Okay, so you need to make sure, like I said before, you choose a temporary cement. So ZOE comes in a temporary cement. Polycarboxylate comes in a temporary cement. So that's why I'm saying you'll see the same names, but you have to make sure it says temporary. That's one of the biggest mistakes that happen. Make sure whatever cement you're using the temporary version. Okay. And then resin also, resin like the material of our composite comes in a temporary luting cement as well. Now, occludes errors that can happen. There are going to be a lot of errors, especially when you guys do this for the first time. So like I always say when we work on a skill, give yourself some grace because it's going to be your first time doing it and there are going to be issues. But the point is to figure out what those problems are and then move forward with not making those mistakes again, right? So some of the issues that usually happen is that there are voids. So you may take the crown off after the material sets and you may see a hole in the occlusal or a hole in one of the other surfaces. It's really not that big of a deal. You can trim it away and then put more material and reseat it right back onto the patient's tooth, and that will fill the hole. Okay. And again, these are some things that you're just going to have to see visually and it'll make a lot more sense. If your material locks on the tooth, some issues with that is that maybe you left the material on the tooth for too long. Okay. That causes it to lock. So you have to remove it while it's still soft, where it took shape, but it's not completely hard, just so you have some time to adjust it. If you have marginal discrepancies, meaning the material is not seated on the margin, all you have to do is add more material and put it right back, seat it right back onto the tooth, and it'll create that margin for you. And then at the end, when you are removing it, the only time you would have issues removing it is if you didn't use temporary cement. So to fix it is to add temporary cement. That's really all you need to do. Make sure you're using the right cement and you won't have an issue with removing it when it's time to take it off. Here are some things you tell your patients. They need to make sure that they chew carefully. This says to avoid sticky foods. Tell them no gum either, because people assume that because gum is not food that they can still chew gum. They should not be chewing gum. They should not be eating anything that's chewy like Laffy Taffies or I don't know what other candy that's chewy like that. When flossing, they shouldn't pop the floss up and down. They should bring the floss down and pull it just so they don't accidentally pull the crown off. And then one of the most important things is if the provisional comes off or if it breaks, they have to come back to the office immediately, okay, for us to replace it or to fix it, okay? That has to happen immediately because the longer they wait, the more likely it is that the gums will overgrow on the margin, and then we have to re-prep that entire tooth. So again, these are things that you have to tell them. Even though we give them like a written home care instructions, you have to tell it to them because a lot of people are not going to read instructions you hand to them. Okay, so to remove it, usually you will not be removing it, the doctor will, okay? So again, it's important to make sure first and foremost so that we don't have any issues, the right cement is there. You have to make sure that before you remove it, you have the permanent crown. We spoke about that before. If you remove a crown and the permanent crown or bridge or whatever is not in the office, it hasn't been returned from the lab, now you have to go ahead and put the provisional right back on. And sometimes when you take the provisional off, it breaks. So then that means you have to remake one. So you want to make sure that you have the actual permanent restoration in the office. I would say to be as careful as possible when you're taking it off, just in case the permanent one doesn't fit. At least you know you have the provisional to put back on. Because once it breaks, you just kind of have to do it all over again. Okay. Are there any questions about this chapter?
No, I have a question about the survey.
Mm-hmm.
So on the classroom thing, it says it's called like blue survey or something like that.
Yeah, so it should say like surveys at EDAF
Yes, okay.
Yeah, the website is blue or something like that. Explorance Blue. And it's just about it should be just about like distance learning or technology. It's to that effect. It's asking you about technology and distance learning, about this process basically. All right, so if you can just search through your email just in case it didn't like you didn't see it, but I'm pretty sure it got sent out this morning, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I see it.
Okay. Are there any other questions? All right, so I'm going to be posting your quiz for chapter 50 on a class marker. It will be there by the end of the day, but you'll have until Thursday to do it. The deadline won't be until Thursday. All right, so just be on the lookout for that. And then of course, go back to 50 and review that information. And then if you guys have any questions before you go into the test, just let me know. All right, thank you guys.